Um, Today we're here to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Dr. Jay Greenberg's and Dr. Stephen Mitchell's book, Object Relations in Psychoanalytic Theory. We also have a cake today for those in person, so be sure to get a bite of that. It's a sweet potato cake. It should be quite tasty. At the time, the book was considered radical by some and now is considered a landmark by most. Dr. Greenberg used to teach an incoming course here with Jay Greenberg, and I remember that well, as I'm sure some of you do as also. Based on Jay's deep knowledge of many theoretical orientations, there was definitely a point when I was pretty sure that Jay was a Freudian. I'm going to go ahead and move to the introductions, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Greenberg first, and we have a very impressive panel of candidates today. And for time, I'm going to give highlights of their backgrounds, but I would encourage everyone to read more about them in the announcements that I sent out. There's more details. So Dr. Jay Greenberg is a member of the faculty and a training and supervising analyst here at the White Institute. He is the co-author with Stephen Mitchell of Object Relations in Psychoanalytic Theory, and author of Oedipus and Beyond, a clinical theory. Dr. Greenberg is the author of more than 90 articles addressing issues of psychoanalytic theory, clinical practice, and the history of psychoanalysis. Dr. Greenberg served as editor of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly from 2011 through 2020. Before that, he was editor for North America of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis from 2007 to 2010. And as editor of Contemporary Psychoanalysis here from 1994 to 2001. In both his editorial work and in his own writing, he has embraced a comparative psychoanalytic approach, which we'll be hearing more about today, beginning with his book with Mitchell, and expanded to include the relationships among approaches that have emerged in different parts of the world. In 2015, he was awarded the Mary S. Sigourney Award for Outstanding Achievement in Psychoanalysis. And like I said, each of the panel members are impressive in their own right. And just some highlights. Gal Katz is a professor of philosophy and writer and a fourth-year candidate here at the Institute. Bevin Campbell, also a fourth-year Institute, is a creator and host of the Psy.D Speakers Live, which is a national podcast. And she also works with the mayor's office on community mental health. Sheri-Ann Cowie is also a fourth year. She's an organizational consultant, executive coach, and educator. Her background is in international business and in group relations and organizational behavior. And Michael Becker, a second-year candidate who is also a professor of philosophy and scholar. So we have two professors of philosophy today. So to start things off, I was going to ask Jay a question, and then I'll turn it over to the panel. And then we're going to save some time for the audience questions or comments. So Jay, in writing this book in 1983 with Stephen Mitchell, I was just wondering, what were your aims or goals that you hoped to achieve? And were the reactions to the book expected, or were some surprising? And I'll hand it over to you, Jay.
It's an interesting question. What were my hopes for it? I actually think that originally my hope was that I would understand the place of object relations in psychoanalytic theory, which I didn't understand before I started to work on the book with Steve. And in working through that. My own confusion about it, because it was a very confused term. And I suppose that it's worth saying that in 1978 or 9, when we started to write the book, the term object relations itself was very poorly defined, and it had been appropriated within many different conceptual systems. So if you were an ego psychologist, an object relations theory was Margaret Mahler's theory. If you were British, it had something to do with Melanie Klein or Winnicott. if you were a Freudian, it was something that was deeply embedded in the structure of Freudian theory, going back to the beginning. So there was a lot of confusion. I didn't particularly. Oh, by the way, if you were an interpersonalist, it was a kind of cowardly term, because you were talking about something that you were talking about an object rather than a person, and so sorting it out for me, and I think also for Steve. I can't speak for him, of course, especially if I can't speak for him 40 years later, was an important part of the project for me. It was also the I suppose, in broader terms or less narcissistic terms, it was a heuristic for other people to be able to track some of those different meanings and different usages and different implications through a variety of models. In terms of the response to the book, I think we were both surprised by how it caught on, by how it quickly became adopted as a reference or a text, or and then it also became involved. This is a very long story that I won't go into, just because it would take up our whole time today. But it also became very involved in the politics of psychoanalysis, which at that time was moving in a kind of centrifugal way. It was sort of leaving its center, which in North America was ego psychology, and in other parts of the world were other models. So
Jay, I can hear the online audience. It's just, you want to speak really close to the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So so the book very quickly got caught up in the politics of psychoanalysis, to the point where it was characterized by many people as being a kind of political manifesto, which I don't think that when Steve and I became curious about the way the terms and concepts were used, that's exactly what it was. But it certainly became involved in the politics of psychoanalysis, both here and in other parts of the world. That was a surprise, and the idea that it was seen by many people as a political manifesto by intent was also a surprise, and for me at least, a bit of an annoyance. Such things happen.
Politics. Thank you, Jay. Gal, do you want to start us off, and then I'm going to let you guys take over.
Hi. First of all, thank you for inviting me and us to this event. This was the first time for me reading the book, because I didn't come from a mental health background, and I was a bit surprised. Why? Because what I've heard a lot about the book, and one of the things I've heard is that it's often credited with the emergence of a new analytic school, relational psychoanalysis. And I'm saying I was surprised, because reading this book, I find this almost like ecumenical passion there, actually to refine some shared conceptual language, the different schools or trends in psychoanalysis. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about it. Did you anticipate such new school emerging? And maybe I will have sometimes in our classes, professors ask us, what's the difference between interpersonal and relational psychoanalysis? Isn't it always a bit of a joke, because it seems nobody knows the answer. So it seems you are the person to give us the answer. So yeah, so I asked more than one question. So
Gal, thanks. By the way, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this and for being here to ask those questions. You know, one of the things about psychoanalysis that's intriguing and also vexing is that when you introduce an idea that you intend to be clarifying, it turns out to be as confusing as everything else because it gets absorbed into so many different systems that what you thought was sort of something that you had in mind to keep outside a system to be a way of looking at or organizing systems turns out to be integrated into different systems in different ways, and so it becomes controversial in its own right. You know, it's something like transference, I think, would be a very good example of that. Maybe more contemporary containment or reverie. I mean, those start out as attempts at clarifying something that has been vague, and it winds up being as vague as everything that you're trying to clarify. So that's the as far as starting a new school. And what I'm going to say comes from a 40-year later perspective. I think certainly what history says is that Steve was interested in starting a new school. And because, you know, within 10 years of the publication of the book, there was a thing that was called relational psychoanalysis that had its own organizations, its own institutes eventually, its own journal, its own meetings. And that, so I think its own hierarchy, its own organizational hierarchy. And I think that was Steve's intention at the beginning, or at least it was there in his mind at the beginning. It wasn't my idea. It wasn't my hope. It wasn't my vision of what is most generative within psychoanalysis to form new schools. My interest, and this is something I couldn't have said this at the time we were writing the book, because at the time we were writing the book, I was interested in writing the book. I mean, that was, and that meant I was interested in understanding Hartman and in understanding Winnicott and et cetera. And that was enough on my plate at the time. But I think subsequently, as I've looked at the evolution of, or the broad landscape of psychoanalysis since then, I don't particularly like the idea of different schools. And I do like it when somebody says to me, you know, you confuse me. What are you, a Freudian? Are you a relationalist? I like that I'm confusing in that way. What I do believe in strongly is the possibility of having different points of view that people believe in and develop, and that they use to interrogate other points of view, and that they allow people to wonder. And I think that that certainly is something that's encouraged by having a lot of evolved points of view, but it's something that I think is not well served by institutions.
And Jay, I know nag is a favorite word of yours, so just nagging is a favorite word of yours. I'm gonna nag you to speak closer to the microphone because
okay.
Just because the online people won't hear. Sorry.
Okay. Yes. Sure.
Go ahead, Michael. You want your question?
Yeah, my follow-up, I think, is in some ways a complement to Gal's observation and question. So not only is the reputation of this book that it inaugurates something called relational analysis, the other side of that is that it involves, again, the reputation is that it involves this kind of withering critique of drive theory and even somehow discards drive theory. And that again seems somehow a mistaken reading of the book, which is very even-handed. Even in its concluding pages, makes no attempt to discard drive theory. It seems you speak very respectfully of these two paradigms. So it might be useful to say, because I'd want to know if I were in the audience, the argument of the book is that there are these two paradigms or models. One is called the drive structure model. The other is called the relational structure model. It's a heuristic. The argument is that a lot of the intellectual history of psychoanalysis can kind of be organized according to this polarity and different attitudes to this polarity and even different attempts to somehow synthesize it. And one of the things you say at the end is actually there's something hopeless about this attempt to synthesize it because they are two very deep, actually they represent two very deep views of human nature. And they're so incommensurable, so incompatible, there's really no way you can eliminate one in favor of the other. So I guess one question to ask is, and this again is following up on Gal's comment, what was the division of labor between you and Stephen Mitchell when you were writing the book? Were there already, was there already kind of a schism, maybe schism is a strong word, were there differences then? To this question of whether drive could be overcome or not. Because again, the way Steve Mitchell took relational analysis afterwards suggests that you really could discard drive theory. It seems like your post-history suggests otherwise. So I'm wondering, even at the time, was there a difference of opinion on this?
Yes. You know, in terms of the book, we worked very hard to be agnostic about the preferences, which, as all attempts to be even-handed, pretty much aggravated everybody. But that's the way it was. But in terms of, see, I think that there are a couple of things that may be, well, they may be clearer now than they were then. They may have been clear then too. But the idea of drive, of course, is associated with the Freudian drives, sexuality and aggression, or originally libido and self-preservation, then eventually libido and aggression, or the life and death instincts, you know, the various iterations, binaries that characterized Freud's particular formulation. My interest in the concept of drive, certainly when we were writing the book and probably thereafter, really had to do with what is the pre-experiential aspect of our minds, of our lives, that give shape to our experience, and that shape our experiences prior to meeting our mothers or anybody else for that matter. And I pretty much insisted throughout, and Steve and I went back and forth on this, and we each thought that the other was essentially deluded. But I suppose what I can say is that that I knew then, and boy do I know now, that if I get up on the wrong side of the bed in the morning, my world looks very different than it does on better days. So I know that I am bringing something to every moment of interaction and every moment of experience. And that has to be, for me, that has to be taken account of in understanding the way things unfold. Steve didn't feel that way. Steve believed in, going back to Aristotle, man is a social animal, and that we don't, when we look at a swarm of bees, we don't particularly think about the experience of any particular bee and how that affects the hive. We think about how the hive affects the experience of the individual bee, which is, Sullivanian, essentially Sullivan's central premise. That's where the distinction came in. And of course, I want to say that a lot of this is history, because this is the late 70s, early 80s that we're doing this, and the psychoanalytic world that we knew is bounded by West 74th Street and East 82nd Street. White Institute, New York Psychoanalytic Institute, interpersonal theory, which was very separate, both conceptually and probably even more importantly, politically, from the hegemonic ego-psychological model. The psychoanalytic landscape, it would get us off into other places, but the psychoanalytic landscape is very different these days. In terms of your practical question about how the book was done, the book started because Steve and I were teaching theory courses at another institute, and I was teaching a year-long course in Freud and the ego psychologists, and Steve was teaching courses in, I think his first semester was Sullivan, and then Winnicott and Bowlby and so on. And we were close friends, of course, and we would talk about our teaching. And we sort of found that that when we talked about what we were teaching, it was very hard for me to talk about, especially the ego psychologist, but even Freud as his theory evolved, without referencing dissenters, without referencing, starting with probably starting with Freud in 1911 or so, and certainly after with the narcissism paper, that a lot of the movement in his theory was a response to others who were criticizing the theory. So the narcissism paper is a response to Jung in large measure. The paper on the 2 principles of mental functioning is a response to Adler. So that there was always a kind of dialogue, not necessarily explicitly articulated, but there was always a dialogue that was going on between Freud and outsiders who he both expelled and integrated into his own theory. And Steve was finding in his teaching that that he needed to reference Freudian theory. Sullivan's first paper was called The Oral Complex, and so he started with Freudian ideas and then developed his own dissent. So the book came out of that, out of those conversations about our teaching and how it was going and what we were thinking about. In terms of the writing, it followed that model, so that I wrote the Freud chapter and then the ego psychology chapters. Steve wrote the Sullivan and the object relations theorists. We also critiqued and rewrote each other's chapters, so that there are places. I mean, it would be very hard for me to say this was my sentence and this was Steve's, because there was a lot of back and forth. Although some chapters were more like more one of us or the other. And I think it also seems to me to be one of the reasons that the book worked well, is that we each liked the authors we were writing about. I think in my writing, as Albert said, I like to be nagged, but I also do my share of nagging, and I think that I nagged my authors a little bit more than Steve nagged his. I think that was a kind of stylistic thing that probably runs through the book. But we each did like the people we were. You have to get that deeply into it, so I just blocked something. Anyway, yes. So,
thank you, Bevin. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, one of the points that's made a few times in the book is that changes in theory are preceded by changes in patients, so that innovations or elaborations of theory come after maybe an expansion of who's considered analyzable or social changes. And when I was reading that, I was thinking about, I guess I'm wondering if there's any generalizations you can make about how patients that you see, that your supervisees see now, are different than when you wrote the book. I guess I'm wondering what that also might suggest about where theory needs to go.
Well, my first reaction is not to think so much about the differences in patients right now, but right now we're in a psychoanalytic cataclysm that was caused by the pandemic, And so, the idea that in February of 2020, you couldn't say anything much more fundamental about the psychoanalytic situation than that it was something that happened between two people who were in the same room together. And then a week later, that was gone. And it was gone for all of us for a couple of years, and for many of us continues to be gone. And none of us is working the way we did in February of 2020. And I know numbers of people, including kind of prominent theorists, who no longer work in person at all. So everything changed, and everything changed in a week. And we have no idea. I mean, I think I say this with some confidence, that we have no idea what we're doing. And that theory is so far behind what we're actually doing these days. Now, of course, psychoanalysts, I mean, we invented the concept of, as far as I know, of rationalization, and we're very good at it. We're unsurpassed at rationalization. And so there are a ton of explanations of what's happening. But I think that I emphasize over and over the cataclysmic nature of the change, and that that we don't know if we're trying to do the same thing as we were trying to do before. We don't know if we can do this, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you a very simple example. If in mid-February of 2020, if a patient said to us, to any of us probably, I can't come in on Wednesday because I've got a meeting at work, so can I call you instead? We would wonder about that. I'm not saying we would. Some of us would do it, some of us wouldn't do it, all sorts of different, but we would certainly wonder about it. And we might wonder about it out loud. We would certainly wonder about it internally. We no longer wonder about that. Of course you can call. And if I find myself wondering about it, what happened in the last session that might have contributed to the patient wanting to stay away today, I can't help think, well, yeah, I'm going to ask the patient how come he or she is staying away. But by the way, I'm going to be out on Thursday. We'll be on the phone. And so what happens to that edge? We just don't know. Again, is it good or bad, or both, or neither? I mean, so that I think right now, in terms of theory, what I kind of notice is that most theories are rolling along happily, but they haven't caught up with the cataclysm, and that's for future development.
Thank you, Jay. Sheri-Ann?
Sure, thank you. Jay, this will follow up on what Bevin just talked about, what's the new theory? If we're looking at when our patients change, it can create new theory. And what I was thinking about is maybe if we talk about, instead of patients, what happens when maybe members or members of an institute or organization before you said the fight was, or the schism was mostly conceptual and political conflict between the models that were being used. And with you and Steve and Mitchell, there was conflict. You had different ways of thinking, but even when you thought each other were deluded, there was a way you could inquire and kind of interrogate each other. And so what I'm wondering about is, in our institutes today, there seems to be bundling, you know, and you have a cable service, you can only use, you bundle your phone and you just stick within that. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of unbundling through inquiry and interrogation. When there's a difference in opinion, we see it play out on listservs, we see within the organizations, there's more conflict. So not across with models, but how you have to think and be in your organization. So my question for you is, what would your book look like today? What's the book we would be writing today if we look about where the conflict is now in psychoanalytic organizations and institutes?
Okay, well, I think it's a big question, Sheri-Ann. I would, I guess I would want to start with where things were then and how at least some of that has changed now. Yes, Steve and I thought we were deluded. The other was deluded, but enjoyed talking to each other. And at that time, there was also a lot of rancor among adherents of different traditions. I mean, we were told that we, by we I mean all of us here who came here, were told that we weren't real psychoanalysts. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that I suppose when, you know, there were, this gets a little bit away from the book, but when in one of the iterations of White Institute's negotiations to join the American Psychoanalytic Association, you know, it got to a certain point, and there was a meeting between, there were three of us from White and several people from the American Psychoanalytic, and I in particular was singled out and told that I was attempting to destroy psychoanalysis. Wow. And I was told this by the head of the Board on Professional Standards of the American Psychoanalytic Association. So
that's quite a spanking.
Or a compliment. It was, you know, it was kind of, but would you like to know what my crime was?
Yes.
I said that we thought that an analysis could be done at 3 times a week. Wow. And so there was that kind of rancor. Mm-hmm. And also another thing that was going on at the time, and that I think was important and interesting, is that as I sort of mentioned before, you know, we saw the world as divided between the east side of New York and the west side of New York, and we were not. None of us on either side of town was aware that there were things going on elsewhere. That there was a whole Latin American psychoanalytic movement, that there was a lot going on in Italy, other parts of the world, and so that and partly that was because psychoanalysts don't like to be confused by too much going on, but also because just logistically, things weren't translated into other languages so much. So we were really, stuck in an Anglophone community, and so that was the world that we were operating in. I think that today, obviously, things are very different, and if any of us who's reading the listserv of the American Psychoanalytic Association knows how much bitterness there is within that organization as that organization tries to open itself up to different voices. The different voices are not welcomed with great enthusiasm, and the idea that we as psychoanalysts really have to start looking in different places to draw on our ideas and to develop our ideas is not openly accepted. I'm distressed at this point that we don't have ways of talking to each other, that we are many of us feeling threatened, and I'm not sure where things are headed. It goes, of course, way beyond theory, although it's going to involve changes in theory, or at least an openness to think about changes in theory. We're not in a great place in terms of discourse.
Thank you, Jay. And on a historical note, and Elizabeth Kermendal, I think you might have had a comment, but also help me with this one. I don't think we didn't join the American Psychoanalytic Association, I think, until 2011. Is that correct? 14, maybe a little later. I was on the committee that was, looking at whether we would join. So the rancor was still there, maybe not quite as intense, but this is still recent history, actually.
It's very recent history, and at the time that the book was written, it was, it really made it impossible for people to talk to each other across institutional lines. Now, of course, it's becoming impossible for people to talk to each other within their own institutions, but so I guess we moved forward.
Jay, just one piece, you had said, we don't have ways to talk to each other, and maybe this is how we can generate some new theory. What I wonder about is the existing theory. What you and Steve Mitchell did is look at the existing theory and really pull out the essence of them and how the similarities, right? It was comparative analysis. How can we, I want to make sure that we can also use existing theories to find ways to talk to each other.
Yeah, what I want to say, I think is important, is that the doing comparative psychoanalysis is very, very hard. And thinking, it's very hard because it destabilizes us. And I think at the best of what's going on today is a kind of, that it has the potential for a kind of constructive destabilization, really looking at the premises. There has to, before we can go very far with it, there has to be civility, which there isn't right now. But really I'm trying to think about how to say this. So one of the things that's on the APSA listserv, it's faded a little bit in the last couple of months, but the whole idea of integrating so-called social into psychoanalytic thinking. Well, people have been trying to do that since the beginning. And of course, the conversation is these days very strident and angry and politicized. But it's of course, it's the same problem that Steve and I were struggling with in the book. And it's a project that really requires both a lot of hard work and also a lot of calm, because we've really got to unpack things. And we also have to look at history. And we have to look at the way these things have come up in different parts of the world at different times and how they've been worked with it in different parts of the world at different times. It's a big, tough project. It can't be, it's not something that can be accomplished with a sledgehammer.
Thank you, Jay. Elizabeth Krimendahl, did you have a question or comment, or did I? Okay. We have to hand her a microphone up front. One of them, yeah. Our microphones are stretched today.
First of all, thank you, Jay, for being here. It's always fun to hear about the book and how it got started. I'd like to go back, though, to more of the history and the politics involving our institute, because we haven't talked about the splits internally so much that led to the relational movement. While it is true, I think that Steve, even when he was a graduate student or a postdoc, famously told his wife that he wanted to change what psychoanalysis was. He also said in one of the last pieces of writing in 1999 that was published that he always considered himself interpersonal. He never meant for relational to be a kind of movement. So the question really leads me back to what happened at NYU postdoc to start relational psychoanalysis. So there was, and what happened at our institute, there was an interpersonal humanistic track at postdoc, but the people in that track were sort of old school interpersonalists, as I understood it, and were very suspicious of teaching object relations, which is sad because I know at this institute, people like Guntrip and Winnicott did come to speak in the late 60s and the late 70s. Anyway, long story short, so what would have happened to interpersonal psychoanalysis, which I feel has been lost under the term relational in contemporary relational thinking, if there had been more people from this institute that supported object relations thinking at the time instead of being quite wary of it?
My experience of things at that time was that that there was a lot of people had a lot of stake in the uniqueness of interpersonal thinking, and it gets to pride of place, which was a very important driver of the reactions to things. Yes, before my time here, Guntrip was here and Winnicott was here, and but but I don't think that they were, they certainly weren't seen um, as covering the same ground as the interpersonalists. So I remember the first paper that I ever published, which I actually read as a brand new graduate. I was invited to speak to the weekend retreat that we used to have in those days, and I read a paper in which I tried to show that there was clinical similarities between some of Fairbairn's ideas and Sullivan's, which was a kind of linchpin of what Steve and I were doing together. You know, we noticed that similarity. We noticed, and although some people appreciated that, but it was probably the first sort of going public with some of the ideas that shaped the book, because it was a couple of years before the book was published. Some people welcomed it, but some people were very, very annoyed by it. And some people were hoping that both a paper like that and then ultimately the book itself would be an argument in favor of the priority of the interpersonal tradition. And, you know, systems tend to become closed, and you know, think about the early psychoanalytic movement itself. Freud, you know, Freud didn't have discussants at the Wednesday meetings because he didn't. I'll tell you something. I'll tell you a little secret. When I started as editor of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, that's 2011, one of the first things I did, which I'd done at Contemporary Psychoanalysis, and which the International Journal of Psychoanalysis had done for a while, was to have peer review exercises where a paper would be, the group would read a paper anonymously, you know, anonymized, and then would discuss, you know, as if they were reviewers. They're wonderful discussions, and they're very important for reviewers. One of the people who was a kind of old timer at the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, which had been, you know, a bastion of very conservative, very orthodox ego psychology for many years, had changed a little bit, but, you know, really went down the tubes when they invited me to be editor. But said, was really surprised that I would want to have that kind of exercise. And he said to me, you know, we never had that kind of exercise because we weren't supposed to have any questions. We knew what was right, and we knew what wasn't right, and everybody would know. Everybody who was appropriately trained in the system, which I suppose you could substitute indoctrinated for trained, but that was the assumption. That was, I think that's a kind of extreme example, but it's not one that is unique to that culture or that tradition. I think, Fairbairn had a lot of ideas that were similar to Sullivan's. He also had some ideas that were different. It was, and is a fascinating exercise to really look carefully at the areas of overlap and the areas of difference. I'll tell you something that is, for me, these days, probably my area of greatest interest. In comparison, psychoanalysis. At around the same time, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, in North America, there was starting to be movements towards interpersonalizing ego psychology. At the same time, and completely separate, in Latin America, there were very similar attempts to interpersonalize Kleinian theory. Both Sullivan and Pichon Rivera, who drove Latin American psychoanalysis for a long time, were very interested in social psychology as well as in psychoanalysis. And they were very interested in both applying psychoanalytic ideas in a broader community, but also in integrating the social psychological thinking into psychoanalysis. Very similar projects, but Sullivan was a North American psychoanalyst who had learned psychoanalysis through the ego psychologists. So his native language, it's a favorite sort of phrase of mine, is what's our native language? All our native language here is ego psychology, because that's what was spoken by my teachers, by your teachers, the native language of Latin America is Kleinian, prior to the Lacanian turn, which came much later. What is the difference between what happens when you interpersonalize ego psychology versus when you interpersonalize Kleinian theory? You get a lot of overlap, but you also get difference. Let's look at that. Let's look at that very carefully. And to me, and now you can add, Bionian field theorists in Italy, and the Laplanchians, and the Lacanians, and we're all breathing the same air, but we're conceptualizing what we're breathing differently. Our native languages are different. To me, that's a very fascinating and very exciting sort of project to keep in mind. But the but, of course, is that a lot of people don't want to be bothered. People don't want to be nagged, oddly enough.
Thank you, Jay. Before we open it up to the audiences, does anyone in the panel have a follow-up question or comment? Anyone? Okay, so we'll go ahead and open it up to the audience. I will check with the in-person first. Does anyone have a question? Raise your hand and Stacy will bring you a microphone. Okay. Online, any questions? Just raise your virtual hand. Here we go, Claire. Okay, Claire.
Oh, wow. Hi, Jay. Hi, Claire. Thank you. My question started to form when you kept using the word deluded when you were talking about how you and Steve felt about each other, because I know that's not really true. You didn't really feel that you were deluded, that each other was deluded. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yes, but I have to quickly disagree. We really felt that the other was deluded.
Well, in a playful way, though, you know, and so where, I mean, I'm thinking about the, you know, the political climate in this country where so many people in Congress now are saying, well, we used to be able to have these fierce debates and then we would go out to lunch together, and that's not happening anymore. So there's something about, you know, the seriousness of the battles and the anger and the, you know, that's happening within psychoanalysis, within the larger culture, certainly, where people can't be, you know, playfully feel that the other person is deluded. I really know that's not how you felt about each other. And so, you know, there's something about humility about this task that we're struggling with here. There's that, you know, the parable of the elephant where you know, nobody can encompass the, you know, the vastness of the project of figuring out human psychology. So what, you know, what's going on in terms of human psychology that's getting manifested even in the world of psychoanalysis, where people are supposed to be sophisticated about human relations, that there's even a breakdown. I mean, and I guess, you know, there is a history. I mean, I kind of grew up, you know, in the splits of NYU, but it feels like the acrimony is so much more fierce, even within psychoanalysis, and all of our sophistication can't help us get to a place where, you know, where we can deal with each other in a better way interpersonally. So I'm wondering.
Yeah. Although I do want to insist.
We have to debate what the word deluded means, but that's like a whole.
So that said, you know, I think one thing that we really do need to keep in mind, when I'll go back to Freud and the Wednesday meetings and not having discussants there. Psychoanalysis is a very fragile project. If we think that psychoanalysis is aimed at, in some way, broadening people's experience into areas that they are reluctant or find impossible to go into, that's bound to be fragile. And so we in our work, in our everyday work, we live on an edge of feeling of feeling ineffective, useless, obnoxious, unappreciated. I mean, both in terms of the larger culture's disdain for what we do, and also in terms of, you'll pardon an old term, but good old-fashioned negative transference. Our sense of ourselves as effective, and even our sense of ourselves as earnest and really trying hard, is always under attack. That's kind of what we put ourselves into. And one of the ways that we've learned to cope with that is to fall back on the validity and the power of the ideas that we bring into the consulting room. So we use theory as a kind of bastion that protects us from the assaults that we're exposed to. It's a difficult job that we do, just in case nobody had noticed. And theory can easily come to the rescue of the embattled psychoanalyst. I think when that person at the Quarterly said to me, you know, we're not supposed to have questions. This was about papers that were submitted. But I think that's as you know, it's protective. And so when somebody comes in and says, well, there's something else, or maybe you're missing something, or maybe you're distorting something, or maybe you're imposing something, or it gets to us, and we tend to fight back, and that has led to some pretty unsavory kinds of squabbling and being dismissive and aggressive towards anybody who would question us, including theory. It's a tough. It's tough to sort of keep ourselves alive in the midst of that kind of uncertainty or any kind of uncertainty.
Thank you, Jay, and thanks for that acknowledgement. And I think that could be helpful for new candidates, actually. Any questions in the room? I'm just going to watch. Raise your hand if you have it. Bob Langan.
Unmute. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Bob.
I'm glad you used the word deluded, because I think it hits the nail on the head about both why, as analysts, we have to defend ourselves against the wider culture, and also as to the wider philosophical framework that, at least could touch on an explanation of all of this. The problem is that any explanation or any stance you take about anything is a stance. And so you have to protect it. And then there's the other and the orthodox, the right and the wrong. And all of these dualities that crop up about this is the way to go and that isn't, this is the way to understand and that isn't. And the problem is taking a stance at all that is not more open or more fluid or even lacking self-doubt, creates this polarity of conflict. And we get the world with conspiracy theories, people battling against one another for a few acres of grass. All of this human suffering and misery that goes on through centuries of all of our known history, with one little possible door stepping in a direction that doesn't pose the duality and the conflict. If you say that the solution is posed by following the swarm, well, then you're in the swarm, and the individual gets more or less blanked out, and vice versa. If I am the god of the world, call me Elon Musk, and I can cause a lot of damage. But I wonder if there is also room, if you think about it as waves, the wave comes in and then withdraws, and another one comes in, and the thoughts and so on. But I wonder if this leaves a little room for a doubt about what is that psychoanalysis emphasizes. The thoughts I'm having are passing thoughts, and the doubt is the way out, the sense that I can never be sure, that there's no certitude, which leads to an escape from orthodoxy, but not into another orthodoxy, but into a kind of fluid psychological state of being. And of course, this comes from my interest in Buddhism. But I wonder what whether you would agree with that, or what thoughts it sparks in you.
I go back to what Claire said. Steve was deluded.
And so
and so, I mean, for me, at least in terms of the way that, look, what I would say is that Steve was deluded, but I loved him.
Uh-huh.
And he thought that I was deluded, but he loved me. And that made it possible, not to doubt, but to wonder, and to wonder together. hopefully that's something that we create more or less in our work with patients. That the love that gets generated contains the doubts and makes wondering possible.
Thank you. Going to Eric online. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Eric.
Thanks for taking the time. This has been very, very interesting. I want to go back to, I can't remember if it was Michael or Gal, but one of them had asked, as part of their question about the difference between relational and interpersonal psychoanalysis, and I noticed you didn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So brings up two things. One is, do you even find that a relevant question? I mean, it comes up all the time. So from your perspective, is that even an interesting question to wrestle with? And if you do, all these years later, what do you see as maybe the important differences between those two, if any?
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of the thing that I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. I feel very seen. Look, I can speak to the original to the original situation, and to the way that Steve and I conceptualized the difference. We conceptualized relational as an umbrella term that could be put over a group of theories that differed in various ways, but that shared some of the fundamental premises that they developed. So that interpersonal theory was one component of a broader relational model. And it might have its own differences from, Fairbairnian theory, Fairbairnian object relations theory, or, Winnicott's object relations, et cetera, et cetera. Subsequently, the relational model, people were interested in creating a unified and coherent relational theory, and that might have been inspired in some measure by interpersonal theory, but that was not identical with interpersonal theory, either conceptually or clinically. For a number of reasons, including what's been mentioned about, the interpersonal humanistic track at NYU and the way that the relational track split off from that. A question arose about that I don't think is any more interesting than lots of other comparative psychoanalytic questions, like how does relational differ from Kleinian theory, or in any one of a number of other questions. And it got politicized, and it got politicized, I think, especially in New York. So I think to some extent it's kind of a local concern, because NYU postdoc and White are both strong centers of analytic thinking, and in some ways complementary, in some ways competitive, et cetera, et cetera. That said, I'll now tell you more about my 10-foot pole than about your question. My 10-foot pole is that I have not been familiar with the evolution, familiar enough with the evolution of relational thinking over the past 20 years, or for that matter, with the evolution of people in the interpersonal tradition over the past 20 years, to say today, 2023, what are the salient differences. I just don't know. You know, to answer the question, you would have to do a lot of studying. You know, a lot of really reading. You would have to sort of arrive at what you thought of as, if you thought that there was such a thing as a relational point of view, and if there is any such thing as an interpersonal point of view, or you would have to look at people who identify as relational and maybe look at somebody else who identifies as interpersonal and see where, if you can find any interesting differences. So I think that that the question, absent that kind of study, becomes more a political or pride of place kind of question than a conceptual question. Or it's certainly not one that I can answer with any degree of confidence.
Thank you, Jay. We're going to go back to Michael on the panel. I think you had a follow-up question or comment.
Well, it's more a question about, again, the central polarity in the book between the drive model and the relational model. And I just want to read a passage towards the end of the book that I think illustrates this nicely. So you say, it is neither useful nor appropriate to question whether either psychoanalytic model is right or wrong, in quotes. Each is complex, elegant, and resilient enough to account for all phenomena. And this is like after 400 pages of very subtle, you know, exposition and quibbling and criticisms of either. You say the drive model establishes individual pleasure seeking and drive discharge as the bedrock of human existence. The rest of human behavior and experience, including social needs and activities, is derived from the operation of drives and its vicissitudes. The relational model establishes relational configurations as the bedrock of existence. All other human behavior and experiences, including compulsive and impulsive sexuality and aggression, are relational derivatives. And you conclude, each model establishes a different natural order. Each can explain everything. Each model swallows up the other. So for me, this raises a kind of puzzle about what's happened since you wrote the book, because as a kind of empirical matter, there are very few people today who seem willing to defend drive theory, not only in the old classical form, but in any form at all. That might be my mistaken impression of the landscape, but it does seem like it has decisively tilted in a relational direction. So my question is, if these two poles are as bedrock as the passage suggests, that these are kind of perennial structures or paradigms or what have you, like what has happened to the drive side of the equation? One thought I had while reading the book is that in some ways, the neuroscientific image of the mind has kind of filled in the void of the drive side of the equation. Maybe we don't talk about innate constitutional drives the way that Freud did, but maybe the way, you know, the neuroscientific picture of the mind works responds to some of the same need to imagine everything in terms of constitutional processes and events and endowment and things like that. I'm wondering if you have an idea about what's happened to drive theory in the last 40 years.
That's a very good question, and I appreciate it. So you'll pardon my not having a ready answer to it, because I'm not, well. Would it be satisfying to say I don't know? I partly think that the drive model has floundered, because a lot of the treatments that were done under its guidance have proved to be both well, mostly just unpalatable to people. You know, that the world has moved beyond, or our world has moved beyond wanting the kind of experience that drive theorists offered. So I mean, one of the things that I noticed is that you know, starting, I don't know how many years ago, 25 plus minus, people who would go into the office of a committed drive theorist wouldn't stay there very long. It just wasn't a way that they wanted to be met by somebody who they had come to for help. That could get to Sheri-Ann's question about changing patients too. And so one of the first things that I noticed changing was that people who had been committed drive theorists started changing slightly in terms of their technical, their way of meeting patients. They softened. They would describe themselves. Yeah, they would say to me, "Yeah, you guys have prodded us to soften our way of meeting patients. You know, we're no longer so committed to, you know, what had become a kind of almost caricature of technique." And as they started to soften technically, they stopped writing so much about it. You know, and writing case, and then another thing that happened that sort of went along with that is that the way of writing a psychoanalytic paper changed. You couldn't, you know, by mid-90s, certainly by 2000, you couldn't get a paper accepted if you didn't talk about the analyst's experience of doing the work with a particular patient. You couldn't write it. You couldn't get a paper published if you didn't talk about countertransference. That was completely. I mean, read some of the papers of the 50s and 60s. Some of which are, by the way, are brilliant sort of ways of understanding a human being, but that completely exclude the analyst's experience or participation. That that changed the whole nature of the discourse. So I'm not sure that there aren't people who believe in a lot of the principles of drive theory, but they're not writing about it in the same way as they used to. So, so I think that your question is a very complex question about how a discipline evolves and how discourse evolves, and especially a discourse that's anchored in a praxis, in a way of working, and so are there people who no longer believe that that we are who we are because of the way we have of resolving intrapsychic conflicts? I think there are. I think there are plenty who believe that. But that's not what they're going to be talking about in more public-facing presentations.
Thank you. I was going to call on Jack Drescher. He looks like he disappeared, but he was clapping when you said that you didn't know. I wanted to give a plug because you did a recent interview with Jack for the International Psychoanalytic Association, which is available online. And I'd recommend anyone that's interested to watch that with Jay based on one of his recent papers. We have one question in person. If you would just tell us your name first, thank you.
Hi, my name's Kendra. I'm a psychology intern here. And thank you so much. Just noticing your commitment to speaking to the individual who asked the question sort of very intently. It's clear, if you're on the computer speaking to somebody on the panel, and thinking of you as sort of like a flagship for interpersonal relational work. And just wondering if these different modalities are just kind of who we are as people or who we are culturally, whether it's Italy or, South America, uptown or downtown. And I grew up in New York. I'm very sensitive to what it means to be on the east side or the west side or uptown or downtown. And I've externed at New York Psychoanalytic and NYU postdoc, and now here I'm an intern. So just wondering if all this work is sort of speaking to who we are as people and the way that we relate to each other, almost as a callback to like a sort of temperament.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly hope it does, because if we're not, I'm just clinically speaking, because if we're not engaged in that kind of way where we put not just our beliefs but also ourselves on the line and really commit ourselves to what we're talking about with our patients, then we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, I often, since a lot of people think of me in terms of the object relations book and other things I've written, and think of me as fairly conceptual sort. I always think to myself, that's sort of my hobby. And in some ways it informs what I do and is informed by what I do. But what I do is really between me and the person I'm doing it with. That's the way it has to be.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. We'll squeeze in Ginny Hoffman online. Hoffman.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Jay.
One thing you haven't really brought up is that when you wrote Oedipus and Beyond, you kept the idea of drives, but you redefined what you meant by drives. So that was one part of my question. And I was also thinking, I don't think we're going to have time for all of it, but I'll give you the sphere of it. That you went in one direction, Steve went in another direction in terms of the relational movement. And so I was also thinking, so that were Steve alive and the two of you to write a book today together about the different places you'd evolved to, what would it look like, which is partially a follow-up to Sheri-Ann's question. So you can answer that anyway.
Yeah, well, the first part of your question, which is a little bit easy, is that you know what I said before about feeling that the importance of the concept of drive relates back to what I'm like when I get up on the wrong side of the bed every day. It relates back to my own way of meeting the world, and that to me is more important than the particular direction that any particular theorist sees the drives moving us. That's the first thing. I think that where Steve and I would be if he had lived would depend on whether he got through his delusion.
I want to thank everyone for today, and particularly thank you, Dr. Greenberg, and congratulations. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.